Chapter 1. Freedom. Why was everyone always striving to achieve freedom? You know, after so many years of searching, I finally thought I knew what freedom was, but I couldn't understand why so many people claimed it was so wonderful. The whole idea of chasing after that dream no longer made any sense to me. Dreams as a whole didn't make any sense to me. Since quitting my job, well, more like running away from it, I'd wandered across the country from one coast to the other. Didn't matter where I went, things still looked the same. Bleak, miserable, lonely. Not being bound to any clock or responsibility would have been liberating to most, but nothing could satisfy my deep longing within. You know that feeling when you know you're empty but nothing seems to fill the void? That was always my constant companion. To be honest, freedom wasn't all that it should have been. In fact, sometimes I seemed more chained than I ever had been before. For me, sitting and crying made more sense than running, because I didn't know what I was longing for. How could I ever hope to find something I couldn't even name? Darn, the coffee was cold. Feeling the iciness of the ceramic mug against my skin as I cradled it in my hands matched my mood. How long had I been sitting here stirring it, without even once bringing it to my lips to take a sip? Doesn't matter, Cindy. The coffee was the price of admission. I sat there in my almost clean best patched jeans, my not so holy blouse, my never make the cover of Cosmo's shaggy long haircut, and my ragged, chewed manicure. I could only imagine what those around me must have been thinking. Look at that oddball. Why doesn't someone tell the poor fool that homeless people are not wanted? Find a job. In the past few years I'd heard all of that plenty of times, and so much worse. If only they knew me. If only they knew my story. But even then it wouldn't change their opinion of me. No, would only make me even lower in someone's eyes. If they could see beneath the homeless exterior I'd shown the world for so long now, it would be their turn to run. That was a mask that was now fused onto me, a part of me, and I had no plans to ever take it off again. I looked around the mom and pop cafe in that small town in eastern Pennsylvania on yet another cold spring evening. I could spy only a few customers. These good folks had been looking at me in curiosity off and on, trying not to stare but failing. I could feel their eyes on me every second. You learn to ignore it when you're in my position, but it still sometimes makes your skin crawl, makes you want to climb into the nearest hole. You must fight that feeling and go on. These people may give you a slice of bread when you need it the most. Then again, they more than likely wouldn't. Tables in the cafe dingy, the padded benches patched, the flowered wallpaper faded from the sun, the food served generous proportions. Was that why customers kept coming back? When your stomach gurgles at the mere thought of food, you know you need to keep your mind on something else. Before the hunger overwhelmed me, I put my chin in my hands, my elbows resting on the table, trying to imagine why there was a lack of customers here today in this nice little spot. I peeped around again. My guess was that it had more to do with the downpour, which had continued all day, than anything else. Everything outside was soggy and wet. The packed dirt parking lot was fast becoming a swamp. Yet in here was cozy. Returning the stares of those around me, I got a good look at my fellow diners. Most of those huddled at the tables around me were middle class, dressed in button-down shirts and ties or slacks and blouses. Singles whether for dinner or life I couldn't say. Those are the people who mostly look down on the homeless. They knew they were only one paycheck away from being there themselves. You hear so many sob stories over the years from people like them. You become almost immune to the horrors of it all after a while. They all swore that they never thought homelessness could happen to them. Yet they'd slip through the cracks onto the street with such ease. For me, there was no slipping. I jumped head first into this life, fully believing that this was better than anything else I'd lived through. Hard to say if I was right or wrong on that score. Forget the people, forget the stares, back to daydreaming. When was life better for you, Cindy, I thought. When were things sort of okay? College, now those were the good days. Barely working, barely studying, enjoying those last few years before officially becoming an adult. I was sort of out from under the heavy hand of my father, but not yet under the thumb of my husband. Funny how so many of my classmates stated that they'd love to go back to the era of the 60s. You know, drop out of life, become hippies and hang out, forever living like kids who never would have to grow up. They all only wanted to be free. When you're 18, nothing seems out of reach. Nothing's impossible. The whole world is a glorious unknown just waiting to be explored. My classmates wanted to know what it was like not to be bound to the rat race forever. Their poor, unfortunate parents were slaves to their jobs, their mortgages, their car payments, their social standings. We didn't want to be like that. It would have been nice to stay in that simple, pre-adult state forever, when life was happy, carefree, unburdened. College encouraged that sense of freedom. So many professors never caring if you showed up, nobody watching to see when you finally got to bed, or even if you ever did. Usually someone else was paying the bills. There were parties to attend, games to be played, dances to be danced, boys to be kissed, games to cheer at, movies to go to dressed in costume, nights where you'd lay out in the grass of the quad watching the stars with 50 other people, life to be lived with wild abandon, never caring what happened next. You were there to enjoy every moment as if it was your last. That was life at 18. But it all was an illusion, nothing but a lie. Those kids didn't understand what a heavy burden living life was. I'd already lived more life by college than most people did in a lifetime, and none of it was good. And now I'd seen so much more, gone further than I ever should have gone, and couldn't go back even if I wanted to. What were the words to that old song? Yes, I remember now. Freedom's just another word for nothing left to lose. Yes, that was what freedom was. I'd found that out the hard way, over the course of many wasted years and many miles of wasted traveling with no purpose. I'd learned so much, a lesson that no one should ever learn. Freedom. Honey, the rather large, plump, older waitress stood by my table. Dull, dirty blonde hair was pulled back haphazardly in a loose bun. Her brown uniform was stained with grease and grime. She wore a tan apron with pens and pads sticking out from pockets at odd angles. Still, she looked better than I did, though that wasn't saying much. I guess I'd overstayed my welcome. Should have seen that coming, since I was enjoying the comfy, albeit worn bench for so long. The warmth of being indoors was so nice, so much so that it had been easy to not notice that time. What? My loud, rather curt voice shot back as I gripped the table so tightly my knuckles turned white. I almost wanted a scene. Letting everyone know I was more than a homeless person seemed important at that instant. Someone with feelings and needs that had to be met. Someone who honestly knew that she didn't have anything left to lose, including the dignity and pride that she sometimes felt she never had in the first place. Everything okay? You's been hunkered over that cup o' joe for hours now, but as far as I can tell you ain't hardly touched it. I'm a real good listener, if'n you's want to talk. She kept nodding her head like a bobble-headed doll and wringing her hands. Huh, wonder if she was afraid to approach me. She seemed nervous enough despite her warm words. Trust me, you don't want to hear my story. Too long and uninteresting. How much do I owe you for the coffee? Hoping it wasn't much, since I only had about $1 in my pocket, I had to ask anyway. You never can take anything for granted in this life. I should know. Oh, nothin', honey. She's on the house. If'n you's want to come back and talk, I'm here till 9. Not like we's really busy here. She cocked her head, giving me a concerned smile as she waved her hand around to show the lack of customers in the room. Thank you for the coffee. Gathering up my rather dirty, worn coat and tattered umbrella, I stood up. With her hands now firmly planted on her ample hips, she'd become a wall standing in my way. I was tempted to climb over the back of the bench, make a bigger scene than I already had. Careful not to bump into her since she was standing so close to the small table, I did a little sidestep instead. The look on her lined face was priceless, a sad puppy dog face, like she cared what my problems could be. You shouldn't care about strangers. You don't know what kind of can of worms you might be opening. You might be getting the worst surprise of your life. You might be getting me. I'm no angel. I looked outside. It was still raining and getting dark fast. However, that wasn't half as depressing as the look on that waitress's face. I couldn't explain why it bothered me so much. Usually I didn't care what others thought about me. It just did. It was like I was walking out on the only true friend I'd ever had, would ever have, which was ridiculous because I knew nothing about her and wasn't sure I wanted to. And besides, she knew nothing about me. Once anyone ever did, well, they would never want to be my friend or even be around me for long. After all these years, the freak image was still intact. The unlovable freak, that's me. I'd learned long ago who I was, and it wasn't a pretty sight. Ugly ain't only on the outside. You know it's true. As my hand hit the door handle, I heard her whisper, "God bless you, honey. He cares. He truly does." Then I stepped out into the rainy evening, shivering as a sudden burst of cold hit me. Pulling on my coat and picking up my well-used pack I'd left just outside the door, I began to wish I still had my car. When I'd begun this never-ending, seemingly pointless journey, I had an old Toyota, but it had long since died at this stage. That car was a tribute to its manufacturers. It had almost 300,000 miles on it with few repairs done before it gave up the ghost. Finally, the transmission had given out. No way I could have afforded to repair something so major. Even at that point, so early in my wanderings, I was having a hard time finding enough odd jobs to pay for gas, as well as food. You know, some things are more important than others, and food has to be at the top of that list. So I'd sold the car somewhere in Oklahoma, I think, although I wasn't exactly sure when and where. The days had become so blurred together, especially lately. I couldn't seem to remember even the simplest things. Those details were in my journals, like many other now pointless facts. Did anyone care if I'd been to Tulsa or Tacoma or Tallahassee? Did I? Most days I didn't mind the endless walking I often did, or camping out for days without end. But when the weather was bad, I missed having shelter. Any shelter. When you have no home, you look at things in a much different light. Sure, hail could dent a car, but it could also kill you. You learn to seek shelter in the oddest of places. A car provided adequate protection from the elements, so it was ideal. A car was much safer and warmer than a tent. But what if you didn't have a car? Well, then, you had to be thankful for a tent if you had one, or thankful for a tree if that's all you got, or you snuggle up to a dryer vent if that's the best you can do, grateful if it pumps out hot air once in the night, anything to keep going one more day. Today was one of those bad days, damp and dreary. Finding a campsite before I became soaked and it got to be pitch black needed to be a priority. I almost turned around to re-enter the cafe to ask for directions, but that would mean facing that waitress again. And you're not doing that, Cindy. She'd want your life story. It was never fun to pitch a tent in an unfamiliar place in the dark. Being wet to the bone on top of it, well, that just meant setting myself up for one uncomfortable night. My nights were miserable enough with my morbid thoughts as company. No point making things worse by being foolish. Shaking off my thoughts with an all-over body shudder, I began to walk up the road as I always did, placing one foot in front of the other. Splash, splash, splash. I walked through the puddles. Too bad there were no dry socks waiting for me at the end of this march. Or a heater. Want to know an ideal way to spend your rainy spring evening? Walk for about half an hour with an umbrella that leaks. Scout for possible campsites while water is running down your back. Curse your rotten luck that you ended up exiling yourself to a life like this. Bring a date, a bottle of wine. Try to light a candle. You'll have a grand time. I should know. I did all those things often enough, and tonight was no exception. Freedom was so wonderful sometimes. You'll see. Give it a try. Or better yet, stay chained to your mortgage in your snug, dry house. The place I found was about a half a mile off the highway. In the dim light it was hard to make out, and I'd almost missed it. I'd learned to never camp too close to the road where I could be spotted easily by cops. Couldn't be too careful around cops. Some were good and would give you help. Others would escort you across the county line and ask you to never return. No, cops weren't people to be trusted unless there wasn't another option. But I also didn't want to be too far from the road that I couldn't get help if I needed it. Just one of the many little rules of survival that had served me well. The ground was almost dry under the shelter of the trees. Setting up my pup tent was easy. It's not like I hadn't done it a million times before. My hands could put up that tent without me even looking at what I was doing. The tent was my closest ally, but even it would let me down some day. My last one had, and I'd replaced it without a thought. Well, some thought was involved. It wasn't like I walked around with a lot of spare change and could replace a tent at the drop of a hat. No, a great deal of hard work had been involved before I could move on with a new tent, and I'd hated every moment that it had cost me. Yet another meager dinner of stale bread, and the last square of an old chocolate bar that had turned white. Someone had given me the bread a few days ago after I did some yard work for them. It was stale the moment they handed it to me. Those are the days when you should fight back, when you should say you are worth more than a worthless scrap that they were going to throw away anyways. But you don't, because you know you won't have anything to eat if you say anything. Something is better than nothing is your motto. So there I sat in my tent, in my wet clothes, eating garbage in my misery. Again. With a sigh, I settled down with my current notebook to record the day's events. Most days, I simply wrote a word or two about where I was and who I'd met. Lately, not even that. Yet another failure in my life. My mind began to wander again. Over the many years and miles this trek had taken me, pictures began to form. Tears came unbidden and flowed down my cheeks, staining the front of my shirt. How many homeless shelters and soup kitchens have you seen? How many times have you picked up odd jobs from nice people along the way for a meal or a little cash? Or even the not so nice for a few rude remarks? How often have you slept in a bed without sheets because it was the only bed available? How many times have you pitched this tiny pup tent, or for that matter just slept under the stars? But Cindy, you have freedom. My most valued possessions were my notebooks, my journals. I had one for each of my 10 years on the road. They were small, and I wrote in tiny script. Space in my pack was at a premium. So many things were more important than these small mementos. At times I'd read them to try to justify those years. I was never successful. The years seemed like such a waste of my few talents and of my last remaining years of youth. Tonight, though, I couldn't concentrate on what I wanted to write. I couldn't do anything more than flip through the well-worn pages. I wasn't seeing the words, my vision fuzzy because of the tears I couldn't stop. For some reason, what that waitress said stuck in my mind. He cares. Why should this God care about me? I hadn't stopped to give much thought to who or what a God might be, but I was sure that if there was one, he wouldn't care about me. There was way too much water under that bridge. When I was younger, I remember only going to church at Christmas. To go to midnight mass with my very elderly grandmother was like a treat. It was the only time she would come anywhere near our house. I'd sit and wait by the front window, my small nose pressed against the glass, waiting with eager anticipation to see her old car pull up out front, because she wouldn't come in. I had to run out to her. She wouldn't even leave her car. In fact, that was the only time I ever saw her. Those trips to mass, until the year I sat and waited, but she never came. Finally, my father said she wasn't going to be coming again because she had died months earlier. Without a word, I went to my room and changed out of my dress. Feeling nothing for this woman who had left me without a word of goodbye didn't seem out of place in my strange world. Odd that my father had said nothing earlier, but I guess it was another way for him to torment me. In those years that my grandmother and I went to midnight mass, I'd followed behind her, heavy thumps echoing as she hobbled into the church, leaning hard on her cane. It was where I'd enter a special, magical world for one brief, enchanted moment in time. Too bad it couldn't have lasted more than that one night a year. I never understood a word that was said at the service, but you didn't need words to understand what was special in a child's mind. You simply needed to view the place as only a child could. The way the candlelight danced around that darkened cathedral made the trip worth while. All the gold and silver trinkets placed in the niches sparkled. The giant crystal chandelier hanging in the center of the room came alive. The faces of the porcelain statues softened and became real. If you were a child, it was a fantasy world come true. Magically, everything there understood it was Christmas and a time for happiness, joy, otherworldliness. There, for a few moments, I'd forget the tortures of life. Abuse was an everyday occurrence with my alcoholic parents. My first suicide attempt was at the age of 10. But here in this special Mass, I get lost in the fantasy world of warmth and light. It gave me the energy to get through a few more days of anguish. But that wasn't God. That was just warm fuzzies, a feeling that faded as soon as Christmas was over and real life came crashing back in. Now that I was an adult, I'd put aside silly fantasies like midnight mass. I knew better than to believe that there was a God. I knew there was no Savior in this world. Shaking off these thoughts, I realized how long of a day it had been and how bone weary I was. Time to get some sleep, because somehow things always seemed to look brighter in the morning. As usual, I tried my best to snuggle into my thread-worn blanket. Warmth was a luxury I was used to not having. You know you've gone too far from normal when being warm is rare. When one word from a stranger brings back a grandmother who's been dead for almost 30 years. When your days were all filled with nothing, because that was all you had. Sleep for me was usually elusive when I was in this kind of pensive mood, yet somehow that night a deep, sweet slumber overcame me as soon as I lay down. I don't even think my spot was what most people would call comfortable, but somehow I was beyond noticing, beyond caring. In my heart I knew I'd come to the end of everything. Life was wasted on me. I knew that I'd make only one last journey, back to where it all began, though I wasn't sure why I felt the need to finally go home. I hadn't been home since I started this journey, but now I knew I had to. Tomorrow I would begin my long journey home. Waking with the dawn was usually my habit, the sun coming up acting as my alarm clock. This was always the case when I slept in my pup tent. As the sun began its climb, the tiny space lit up with an explosion of light. From the moment I opened my eyes in the morning, I'd see every mote of dust dancing around the tent. You should see it sometime. It was the best way to be awakened ever. Often I lay there watching the light show for a while. Not like I had anywhere to go or any breakfast to eat most of the time. So what was the rush? However, that morning I had a plan nudging me from the back of my mind, urging me to move from my curled-up state and begin my day. Cautiously I unzipped the door of my tent, taking a look outside. You never know what's behind a closed door, or in this case a tent flap. Settling in the opening to get a good look at the grassy field that was between me and the highway, I took a deep breath. Mornings were always my favorite time of day. New beginnings, clean slates, freshness. This gorgeous one began with crisp, clean air left over from the rain the day before. One thing I'd learned was to enjoy simple and just be. If you scrunched up your eyes to look, you'd see each drop of dew on the grass. If you tuned out everything else, you'd hear the birds in the distance and identify the distinct calls. Or you could be a jerk and stomp around, noisy and loud, missing everything. Most people do, but I don't think it's right. Pennsylvania wasn't as wonderful as the Arizona desert after a rainstorm. Not that anything could top that. Now, when was the last time you were in Arizona, Cindy? Think. But I couldn't seem to remember. Why was everything so unclear lately? It was like my brain was completely fogged over. Nothing could penetrate through the dense haze I was in. Vivid pictures of Arizona came to my mind. Even if I couldn't place myself there at a particular moment in time, it was still like I was there. Arizona, well, the whole Southwest, was by far my favorite place to go. Warm in the winter and as desolate as I always felt. There was a bond between the prickly cactus and me. We were the untouchables, the unlovables, yet strong enough to outlast everything, no matter how little care we were given. We could wait for the sweet rain, when and if it ever came. But my life never seemed to have rain any more. I never blossomed, never became something worth showing off. All too soon I was becoming one of the cactus skeletons left to decay out in the hot desert sun. Up there in the Arizona desert you could smell the rain, that oh, sweet, sweet rain in an area that was always so very parched and dry. With sand blowing in the wind, everything felt gritty. The rare feeling of wetness was extraordinary. The sweet rain that could bring life or deny it if it never came. the simplest, purest source of life in the world. Before any storm, the smell of dust hung in the air, the electricity so strong it could make your skin prickle. The heat sometimes seems oppressive, like a weight bearing down on your shoulders, trying to grind you into the hard, thirsty ground. The grit whipped around in the wind or formed the many tornadoes called dust devils. The smell of the rain was there long before it ever arrived. The anticipation hung in the air, and you'd feel cheated if it never came to pass. Then after the storm had swept by, the sweet smell of the clean air and water, there was the knowledge that life had been renewed. You could see it on every plant as water dripped to the dry desert floor. The desert would bloom and flourish, if but for a short time. Why couldn't people have the experience of rain like the desert flowers? The flowers are smart enough to reach up as if to grab each raindrop as it falls. Was everyone like me? The prickly cactus that had dried under the hot sun, a withered shell clinging to life in a parched land, yet still able to hurt others with the sharp barbs that were left? No, most people were soft and good, flowers, not cacti. You know I'm right. A bird's loud caw startled me out of my wandering musings, which was a good thing. I would have sat there all day otherwise. Well, Cindy, so even the beauty of this day couldn't clear your dark thoughts. Knowing I needed to find a way out of the deep funk I'd been in for the last several weeks, had to do something different, anything different. This was by no means new for me to be holding on to such morbid thoughts and feelings, but this time felt unusual somehow. I might have been wrong last night. Maybe my journey wasn't over. Maybe I should try to hold out a little while longer. Maybe I was like a desert rose that must wait years for the right conditions to bloom. Maybe today I'd get a real answer as to why I should continue to live. Why I should continue to go on, find a way to rejoin the human race, if in fact I'd ever been part of it to begin with. Nodding my head, I said out loud, with as much gusto as I could muster, "Time to hit the road." After my last half piece of stale bread, I did my quick morning toilette. Knowing it was best not to smell bad, I always carried a few wet wipes to clean up each day. Then I broke camp, loaded up my pack, and headed again into the unknown. Well, the almost unknown. Most of this territory I'd crossed and recrossed before. As I headed across the damp, grassy field towards the road, I noticed a car was stopped along the side. Stopped cars always made my heart beat quicken and often made me a little bit queasy. Of course, that was ridiculous. I was always hitching a ride somewhere, but being alone while hitchhiking made it more dangerous. I'd gotten into my fair share of scrapes over the years, so I'd gotten plenty of first-hand bad experience. Yet I still continued on my crazy quest for whatever it was I was searching for. Seeing someone climb out of the small red sports car and waving, I squinted to get a better look, but gave up. Even as he rounded the car, I couldn't get a clear view because the sun was in my eyes. As I drew nearer, he started shouting at me as he leaned against the car. One arm was draped on the top, one foot propped on the side, but his voice was carried away in the mild breeze. Finally, I got near enough to understand. "Hey, I want to help." It was a strong voice. A cop, maybe? I'd been arrested before and actually enjoyed it some of the time. Good hot food? Usually. A dry bed? Sometimes with an almost comfortable, albeit thin mattress. A warmer blanket? No holes unlike mine. Protection from the elements, or I should say better protection than a tent provides. Price of admission, you might ask? Well, all that can be yours for stealing a loaf of bread when you hadn't eaten in days. All in all, usually not a bad deal as long as you were in a small town, with a jail that only had room for a half dozen or so inmates. Any more than that and the experience could turn scary fast. "What do you want?" I said as I slipped my pack off to climb the wire fence beside the road, careful not to snag my pants. Not like anyone would notice a fresh hole among all the others, but I would. All the while I was trying to study the stranger as best I could. I had a general rule against riding with a single guy, but sometimes I broke it if he seemed like milquetoast. You know the type, the kind of guy that wouldn't hurt a fly. One who opens the door for you, gives you the last candy in the box, and always says ma'am. But even they can end up punching you in the gut sometimes. He was the tall, dark, and handsome type, in a suit, oddly enough. "My sister met you yesterday at the cafe. My name's Robert. We both thought you might want a lift. I'm going out to the West Coast. It's quite a drive, but I can drop you off anywhere between here and there." By this time I was over the fence and only a few feet away from him. There was something different about him that I couldn't place, Though he seemed to be in his 30s, there was a childlike innocence and peace within him. Yet he somehow seemed old and wise as well. I'd met so many people over the years, but none quite like him. Name's Cindy. Oregon sounds good to me this time of year. As good as anywhere else, I guess. You going that way? It wasn't where I wanted to go, where I felt I needed to go. But he didn't need to know that. Sure, he nodded his head and smiled. He seemed so warm and accepting of me, but he shouldn't have been. I was a homeless stranger, someone you help, but only because you have to, or feel you should. Your sister must be that interesting waitress who spoke with me yesterday. I was rather rude to her. I'm surprised she sent you out. How'd you find me? Curiosity was getting the best of me. I almost smiled back at him. He laughed, and it was almost mystical. Oh, that's easy. This is the only decent camping spot for miles. We can talk more on the drive. Hop in. He opened the passenger door with a flourish and took my pack from my hands, but still I hesitated. It's all right. You can trust me. I wasn't good at split-second decisions. Never have been. This one seemed to be one of those decisions where either way you choose you'd be wrong. I mean, really. I just happened to talk to this guy's sister at a cafe yesterday. Then today he just happens to be going exactly where I say I want to go. Yeah, right. And everyone who wanders into a soup kitchen gets handed a gourmet meal and $100. I was nobody's fool. Okay, I was a huge fool, but I couldn't be fooled by something that obvious. Opening the trunk, he placed my pack inside, and I decided, what the heck, I might as well get into the car as well. After all, everything I owned was in that pack, and I wasn't about to lose all my worldly possessions. Few and meager though they were, I'd lost enough already. Why do you care about those few things, Cindy? I chided myself. You know that everything can be replaced. The only things of any real value in that pack were my journals, and they held value only to me. Everything else was worthless junk, most of which I'd dumpster dive for. But those journals, I needed those. They held me together more days than not, or at least I'd led myself to believe that. There are coffee and pastries for you, since I'm sure you didn't have much of a breakfast yet. He pointed to a cup and a bag that were in the middle console. After putting on my seatbelt, I reached into the bag and pulled out a Danish. Glad for something fresh to eat for a change, I sank my teeth into the sweetness of my treat. Much of my diet consisted of scraps, things people gave me from their leftovers, expired food from typical soup kitchens, stuff in dumpsters behind grocery stores, very rarely fresh food from good soup kitchens, exceedingly rarely things I purchased with my own money when I had some. Ate a lot of processed food, junk food, and pastries. For some reason, these were the things that everyone gave to homeless people. But fresh vegetables and fruit were never high on the list. Needless to say, any nutritionist would have had a fit trying to figure out a way to get me to eat a balanced diet. Well, even one balanced meal would have been a stretch. As we pulled onto the highway, it hit me. He'd said he was going several thousand miles from here. Why was he driving in a suit? As far as I can tell, there wasn't any reason to drive 3 or 4 days in a suit. It would be wrinkled beyond recognition in a short time. So why bother? I looked over at him, trying to get a better sense of who this man was that had given me a ride. But I was coming up with nothing, a total blank. His hands were rough, like those of someone who performed manual labor. Yet his face wasn't tanned and lined as it should be for someone who spent all day out in the sun. The suit he wore wasn't new, and didn't fit him well, but his shoes were custom-made leather, shined to a high-gloss polish, and must have fit like a glove. His dark hair was closely cropped, with a hint of lines shorn into the side, so he kept up with modern styles. I have a short meeting in a town just over the border in Maryland. That's why I'm in the suit, he said, returning my gaze. It was creepy, like he'd read my mind. Arrangements have been made for motel rooms in that town, and I'll drop you off before my meeting. He smiled at me again. I felt warm inside, not sure if it was him or the coffee. Well, thank you. But how could you be so sure I'd go with you? I mumbled through a bite of Danish, not quite believing this bit of good luck was true. He laughed that laugh again. God said all I needed to do was make the offer. The God thing again. I had no reply, but he cares, half under my breath. Why was I making such a big deal out of this? What I'd learned about religion in college wasn't flattering. It was nothing but a silly superstition handed down for centuries, something for peasants and the illiterate masses. It was a crutch to help weak people get through their horrible lives, and a complete waste of time. It's not like it was a big help to me with my miserable life as a child. No, I was sure what little help that there was had more to do with my grandmother than anything else. Trying to steer the conversation away from religion, I decided to switch the subject. So, what do you do for a living that earns you enough to drive a cool car and wear suits? I do this and that, mostly point people to God, he replied with a giant smile. I almost choked on my pastry. Then I almost gagged on the hot coffee I gulped to get a grip on myself. Great. That was the wrong subject to switch to. From the crazy grin plastered on his face, he loved his job. Give him half a chance, and I was sure he'd only be too happy to tell me all about it. Boy, I was in trouble now. Seriously? Sure, he wasn't going to hurt me, or at least the odds were in my favor, but he could definitely mess with my head, and I was already in a kind of weird place mentally. Plus, I was more or less happy with my established anti-religious stance. Well, as far as it went, or as happy as I was about anything. And this car was given to me by a guy who knew I needed it. My job is lots of fun, but I tend to travel a lot, hence I needed a reliable set of wheels. The huge smile was still on his face, like he was proud of the fact that he was too poor to buy his own car. Trust me, that wasn't something to be elated about. Oh, so I'm sorry about being rude to your sister yesterday. Do you live in the same town or were you visiting? That was the best I could do to steer the conversation away from touchy subjects. I reached for my second pastry, this time a bear claw. He erupted with that laugh again. She's my sister in Christ, not my real sister, and I was visiting that town as part of my job. Ugh, this was going downhill fast. It was now obvious that I wasn't going to be able to get this conversation on safe ground. I needed a way out and quick. Maybe this wasn't such a good idea. I mean, me accepting your ride. I frowned. Having heard this kind of talk before, I knew it only came from those that were crazy into religion. You know, those people who stand on street corners with a sign saying, "Repent, the end is near," or those that handed out tracts to everyone they met. I didn't need this today of all days. Relax, he said, like that was possible. I was in the proverbial snake pit with no hope of escape until he stopped the car. Or I could jump out while I was driving down the highway at 70 miles an hour. Right now, that wasn't looking like such a bad option. He was silent for a few moments, staring straight ahead at the road speeding by. Unhappily, I munched on my pastry. At least I'd leave this car well fed. So, when did you begin your journey? He began tapping his fingers on the steering wheel. It was kind of annoying, making my heart race faster like it was trying to outpace his fingers. Oh, good. A nice safe question, so to speak. And unless he asked why I decided to become a bum, I was okay. About 10 years ago. Oh, my goodness. That's a lot longer than I would have thought. How have you lived? I mean, have you been camping the whole time? His face was now lit up like I was the most fascinating person he'd spoken to in a long time. But I knew how far from the truth that was. I'm a nobody. Nothing more than another nameless, faceless, homeless person. You don't walk up to a bum on the street and start a conversation. Or at least you shouldn't. No, I've slept in shelters, barns, parks, cars, you name it. I looked down at my feet. I suddenly felt ashamed, but not for being homeless, for being me. Knowing who I hid from the world, I was concerned that somehow Robert could see a little piece of the real me. I knew that was impossible and irrational. But you know that feeling you get when you've eaten a cookie before dinner? You're hiding it from your mother because you know you'll get in trouble? I was beginning to sweat under his scrutiny, even though he wasn't looking at me as he drove. Tell me a story. That voice of his had such a calming effect on me, and my feeling of unease began to melt away. It's like he really cared about what I'd seen and experienced, like the waitress from yesterday, his sort of sister had. But why? About what? I asked as I reached for my third pastry, another Danish, and took a few more sips of coffee. I needed a few moments to compose myself, to try to put my mask back on since it must have been slipping, to reinforce the walls around my heart so no one's care could affect me, so nothing could reach me. Isolation was better than being hurt again, or hurting others again. Anything you think was important in those years of wandering. Thankfully, his fingers stopped their cadence, and the car fell into silence. That left the door wide open. I had to stop and think for a few minutes. Was anything truly important in all those years? The silence of the car came back to me, as if to answer a resounding no. But so much had happened, so much had gone wrong, This journey wasn't what I thought it was going to be. I'd gone everywhere, but in fact had gone nowhere. Yet the one sound in the car was the steady but faint in and out of our collective breaths, and my heartbeat in my ears. That was in itself an answer. I was still here. That had to mean something, right? But why would he even care about any of that? About who I was, where I'd been, who I'd met, what I'd done? But he was giving me a ride. So maybe I should break my rule of never sharing, and indulge him with one quick story? Well, a few winters I've stayed in the Southwest. The winters are great down there with lots of sunshine, plenty of warmth, and no snow if you go far enough south. I was thinking about Arizona, the desert part, this morning. The smells from yesterday's storm brought it all back. You know, the clean scent after it rains? Pausing for a minute, I could see a page from one of my journals. Might as well be holding it in my hand. October, Arizona. Crazy college kids. Soup kitchen. Okay, so the finer points were missing, but what was important was there. Anyway, I remember going to this little soup kitchen and lunch my first day there. It was down on the south side of this town in far southern Arizona. The people were wonderful. An added bonus about telling a story? I wouldn't have to think about what would happen when I finally got home, or if I really wanted to go home after all. What if I'd been incorrect the night before and this wasn't the end of my journey? What if home wasn't where the answer lay? Or if there wasn't an answer at all? Confusion seemed to be my stock in trade.